I'm Dave, and I founded StoryCorps about 12 years ago. So just before, there it is. So people here, have you heard of StoryCorps? Yeah. Okay. All right. Anybody participated? Yeah. A couple people. Oh, good. And who hasn't heard of it and wants to get back out in the cold Chicago air and get this done as fast as possible? Okay, a few people. Thank you for your honesty. So StoryCorps, what is StoryCorps? StoryCorps started. I used to make documentaries for public radio, and did that for decades, and did a lot of social justice work. Did stories in prisons and homeless shelters and housing projects. Did a bunch of stuff in what was the Ida B. Wells projects down on the South Side, and I did these radio documentaries, and saw when I was on the South Side or on death row that when I interviewed, say, a guy in Texas on death row and asked him about his childhood, what his dreams were, that he had never been asked these questions before, these guys, and that it was an important, sometimes kind of even transformative for people to have these conversations and have the opportunity to speak their truth. And did documentaries for many decades, loved doing it, was thrilled to get a MacArthur Fellowship. And MacArthur folks here? Who's here? Hi, all you. Hi. And actually, it was a MacArthur Fellowship that, and I love doing it, but getting the MacArthur Fellowship, which was a phenomenal thing, gave me kind of the imprimatur to try this crazy thing, which is StoryCorps, which basically takes documentary and turns it on its head. Because when you make documentary, the purpose is to in radio or TV, you interview a bunch of people to create this final product that hopefully, many, many people hear or read or see. And with StoryCorps, I wanted to turn that on its head and say that that final product isn't what it's about. It's the opportunity to give as many people as humanly possible the chance to be heard in this way. So 12 years ago, we set up a booth in Grand Central Terminal where you can bring anyone who you want to honor by listening to their story, a parent, grandparent, a friend. And you sit in this booth with a facilitator. Morgan is here somewhere back there, who's a facilitator. One of our many, we've had hundreds and hundreds of facilitators in the 12 years of StoryCorps. You sit with, say, your grandmother for 40 minutes in this booth. It's the lights are low. It's this kind of sacred space. And you talk and you listen. Many people think of it as, if I had 40 minutes left to live, what would I say to, what would I ask of this person who means so much to me? At the end of the 40 minutes, there are two copies of this interview. One goes home with you. The other goes to the Library of Congress, so your great-great-great-great-grandkids can get to know your grandfather, your grandmother through her voice and story. Started out as kind of a crazy idea. I was very concerned when we opened that I didn't know what was going to happen. Like, I worried about Jerry Springer, people killing each other in the booth, or I didn't. And now we've actually, at this point, 250,000 people have participated in StoryCorps, either as an interviewer or an interviewee. And not one of these interviews has gone wrong, which is one of the many miracles of StoryCorps. And then, of course, so we call that access to the StoryCorps experience. And we have these booths, as I said, and we've done about 65,000 interviews in those booths, the largest collection of human voices ever gathered. And then we released an app about a year ago, which makes it possible to record StoryCorps interviews anytime, any place on a mobile device and upload it to the Library of Congress, which was also another. I'm a little suspicious of tech stuff and was concerned again with the mobile device if people were going to treat the process with respect. And we saw almost immediately that people who'd never heard of public radio, never heard of StoryCorps, small towns in the Deep South picked up the app, walked through it, and were having experiences completely true to StoryCorps. So that we actually were able over Thanksgiving this year to record 50,000 interviews in one night, which is as many as we'd recorded in the first 10 years of StoryCorps, when we asked U.S. history teachers to assign their students to record StoryCorps interviews with a grandparent or another elder. And then, of course, we have broadcasts on public radio. We have animations. We have books like the one that was released a couple of weeks ago. And I think that the purpose of the interview process is to sit with StoryCorps is really, even though story is in the title, it's really a project about listening. And that time in the booth is about listening to someone who matters to you and telling them how much they mean to you, and that they matter and won't be forgotten. You know, StoryCorps is kind of the opposite of reality TV. Nobody comes to get rich. Nobody comes to get famous. It's this act of generosity and love. And then the broadcasts, which are heard on Morning Edition and are elsewhere, these animations I'll show you. Hopefully, you're going to recognize when you hear one of these stories or see one of these stories, and this is the power of a kind of an authentic story told for no other reason than without any kind of ulterior motives. Nobody comes to StoryCorps ever to get on the radio. That you're going to recognize, hopefully, a little bit of yourself in that person whose story you're hearing, and that recognizing yourself in others. And I think that this is something that Camilo does very powerfully as well, that can help us recognize our shared humanity and the fact that, if we, at this incredibly insane moment in the United States, that if we, listened more and shouted less, how much stronger a country and better a country we would be. So that's StoryCorps, and I thought I'd play a couple stories from I only have a couple minutes. I'm going to watch the time. Let's see. How much time do I have? Alice, did you? Sorry, I got myself confused.
You're already over time. No, I'm kidding.
I'm over time. Okay.
You've got I'll give it 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, let me play a couple stories. Okay.
I know these are short.
So I'll start with this story. We have a book out now called Callings, which is celebrating. It's 52 stories from the 65,000 booth interviews we've done, celebrating people and their meaningful people who found meaningful work and kind of shining a light on the kind of jobs that don't get a lot of love often enough. All of our attention is spent on celebrities and millionaires and billionaires, and these are social workers and teachers and nurses who are doing this incredible work and show a very kind of different path than what we see in the media for what meaningful work is all about. And I thought I'd start with just one, a Chicago story from the book. This is Adedeji Oganiyi, and you see a picture of him with his father there. Adedeji's dad was a Nigerian immigrant, and he was driving his cab in Chicago in 2005, and he was robbed and murdered on the job. At the time, Adedeji was on his way to medical school, but he was also tutoring in an after-school program for extra money. And this is an excerpt of that story, how that moment changed Adedeji's path in so many ways.
11 o'clock that night, the knock came. They told us that my father was found in the alley and he was murdered. I remember yelling no really loud, and my brother was going haywire, and he punched a hole in the wall, and then my mother she started to pull her hair, and she scratched her face. They found the murders in 4 days. They were 18, 19, and 22. I was angry. I was very, very angry. I didn't want to retaliate. I just wanted to just ask them why. What happens to a person? Where do they get lost to become murderers? So, at the time, I was tutoring at an after-school program for some extra money, and these kids came from the same conditions that the people that murdered my father came from. A student came to the after-school program. I was probably around 16 years old. We were doing something where everyone had to read out loud. He stormed out the classroom, and I went out to talk to him, and he just broke down. He said, "It's hard for me to read." There are many people that cry because they're hurt, they've been neglected, but to cry because you couldn't read, that spoke volumes to me. So we got him in some other programs, and he started to read, and it just was like this gift that money can't buy for him. And by me giving that to him, I totally forgot about the pain of the murder, and I wanted to continue to give more of what I had to heal. It just dawned on me. Everybody at some point sits in a classroom. That could be the foundation for everything else. So that's when I said that whatever happened to my father is not going to be in vain. I'm going to follow my heart and become a teacher.
Vantage is a language arts teacher at Thornwood High School in South Holland, just outside of Chicago. I have only a couple minutes left, so I'm going to play one more story from the Callings book. But I will say, just kind of preaching and ranting about the absolute insanity of this country right now, that someone came up to me a couple weeks ago and said, hate is louder than love. And I think there's truth to that, but all of us have to work, and I know all of us at StoryCorps Morgan and there are many people who work at StoryCorps now. Really, the message of StoryCorps is that every life, every story matters equally and infinitely, and I think we're all working very hard to make sure that we turn up the volume on love. There's a nun who had this, who Mr. Rogers used to carry a quote of hers around in his pocket. She's from Philadelphia. Her name is Mary Lou Kanaki, still alive. And she has a quote where she said, "It's impossible not to love someone whose story you've heard." And that's really what it's about with StoryCorps. And we're going to continue working very hard. And we have a very, very long way to go to make StoryCorps part of the woven into the fabric of American life and into the lives of all Americans. And we'll talk about this more. But let me just play. So this is one more story from the Callings book, and a story about hope. It's a story about a young man who grew up to become an astronaut.
When he was 9 years old, Ron, without my parents or myself knowing his whereabouts, he decided to take a mile walk from our home down to the library, which was, of course, public library, but not so public for black folks when you're talking about 1959. So as he was walking in there, all these folks were staring at him because they were white folk only, and they were looking at him and said, who's this Negro? So he politely positioned himself in line to check out his books. Well, this old librarian, she says, this library is not for coloreds. He said, well, I would like to check out these books. She says, young man, if you don't leave this library right now, I'm going to call the police. So he just propped himself up on the counter and sat there and said, I'll wait. So she called the police and subsequently called my mother. Police came down, two burly guys come in and say, well, where's the disturbance? And she pointed to the little 9-year-old boy sitting up on the counter. He says, man, what's the problem? So my mother, in the meanwhile, she was called. She comes down there praying the whole way there. Lord Jesus, please don't let them put my child in jail. And my mother asked the librarian, what's the problem? Well, he wanted to check out the books. And your son shouldn't be down here. And the police officer said, why don't you just give the kid the books? And my mother said, he'll take good care of them. And reluctantly, the librarian gave Ron the books. And my mother said, what did you say? He said, thank you, ma'am. Later on, as youngsters, a show came on TV called Star Trek. Now, Star Trek showed the future where there were black folk and white folk working together. And I looked at it as science fiction, because that wasn't going to happen, really. But Ronald saw it as science possibility. Mm-hmm. He came up during a time when there was Neil Armstrong and all of those guys. So how was a colored boy from South Carolina wearing glasses, never flew a plane, how was he going to become an astronaut? But Ron was the one who didn't accept societal norms as being his norm. I mean, that was for other people. And he got to be aboard his own Starship Enterprise.
And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Camilo.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. I don't know if I can match it. Any case, want to thank the people here. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for inviting me, and I want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for having given me that tremendous award, that tremendous chance to be able to, for 5 years or longer, to be able to devote myself entirely to what I wanted to do. And then, of course, other things came, and David and I are similarly connected to the Library of Congress. So what I do, the work that I do, is being archived at the Library of Congress. Now, I'm a person with an attitude. And by that, basically what I mean is that I came as a student here to the University of Notre Dame, and I couldn't find myself in a place there. I couldn't find myself in a home. They were very good to me, but that was not my place. And luckily enough, one day I ended up in Gary, Indiana. And that sort of changed my life, because I became so interested by that contrast, and I became so interested in the Gary, Indianas of America, that I've devoted my life to that. So the first picture is a picture of downtown Detroit taken in 1991. So what I look at that, and that was a symbol of American failure. But I saw it was like, you know, it was like a vision of paradise for me. I saw in there what I read in a line of poetry, which says, beautiful as a wreck of paradise. So paradise, to be paradise, has to be a wreck. And in going, of course, I went to, let me just see, there it is. So I saw things like this. This is a train station in Detroit. It's a fairly recent picture. And today I went to see Union Station. So it's in some ways, if you want to see what Detroit looked like, you come to Chicago, what it used to look like. I saw a building on, I think it's Capitol Street or something, 101 Capitol. It looked just like the old J.L. Hudson's department store. There were beautiful buildings like this. And of course the lives were miserable, and people didn't like this. And the fact that I like it, it's this very difficult situation where you have to deal with two things that are completely opposite. In other words, one was my liking for ruins, and the other one was the fact that wasn't shared by the people who lived there, and that wasn't shared by the people who were part of the city, and that of course that situation changed over time, but changed mostly for outsiders, but not for the people in Detroit. Let's see the next one. So this is to give you some examples of a neighborhood of buildings that, to me, in this particular stage, they had a power and a beauty that they never had before, even when they were brand new. There were buildings that symbolized the future. In other words, after World War II was won, then these architects had spent years designing what the new buildings of the new America were going to be like. So this was a Firestone tire dealership. That meant, you know, that's what people in science fiction would put. If you go to Mars, this is what you would see. This is a Dairy Queen. And of course, these images started being discovered by movie makers and artists. And of course, you can see this image in a movie called 8 Mile. Again, think of the Night of the Living Dead and think of zombies. I mean, all of this stuff is really important in our imagination. It expands our imagination. It makes us grow. at the same time, abject poverty coexist with it. So, but the idea is, how do you keep these two things going at the same time, opposite things? Again, here I want to see some of the greatness of Detroit, which still stays there. This is a conservatory, very beautiful building in an island, which is a very beautiful island called Belle Isle. Let's see the next one. That's a mansion for one of the car magnates called Fisher. You know all those cars called Body by Fisher? Well, that's what you get when you do that. So this is an even more beautiful building. It's another one of those mansions in Detroit that you used to get from, you could probably $400,000 could get you that. But then you had to put $5 million to fix it. And that's where the Wilson Mausoleum, where one of the, I think a governor of Michigan was buried there, and he was married to some automobile fortune too. Let's see the next one. And that's the Motown houses. Here is where a lot of the very famous songs that were played in the 60s and 70s, here's where they were recorded, here's where they came out. And that's what the place looks like. And I think this is kind of extraordinary because Detroit, it's a very segregated city. So if you go to different venues, you find either white folks there or you find either black folks there. But here you find sort of a race mixture. Again, it's incredible to think that a building like this is 1987, 30 years ago. So you look at it and you say, no way this thing is going to survive. So you come 10 years later and, somebody has made an effort to boarded it up. I don't know why. And then go to the next one. And then the next one. And then they are rebuilding it. That whole area where you saw this one building that I showed near the beginning, which was lost, is now being revitalized. And the few mansions that were left there are going to be fixed as they are fixed here. And it's fixed. This was an area that was entirely, the few people that were living there were mostly blacks, and now it's being gentrified, as you can see. Again, you used to, this is something I think that I'd share with David here, and I think it kind of made me mad because these things don't get recorded, don't get to place. I mean, here is an operation. Somebody's doing something, those coats come from somewhere. They get placed on a building, on a fence next to a church, and it's a church operation to sort of raise money for the church. And there are the two ladies there which tend to this and sell whatever number of coats and items of clothing. And then they'll be there next weekend and next weekend and next weekend. So I went back, and that's what you see. So I spoke to the pastor, and I said, I had the names of the ladies, actually. One was called Mabel, the other one I forgot. And the pastor didn't even remember their name. It's just like the whole story. This is what you were talking about, David. The whole story disappears, like it disappeared here. So I felt that those stories were important. That we tend to focus on the big things, on sort of putting a new Renaissance Center or putting a new place that employs a large number of people. But things like this is the sort of America of survival. And that America of survival, it's neglected. So let's see the next one. This is from a daycare center. And I'm just showing you one example. In a daycare center where all the kids were black, for some reason they painted the Snow White green. And then they painted her brown. And then I asked, You know, of course, I mean, I had the feeling this was all about race, you know, and about if these are going to be our heroes and heroines, they should look like us. So all the kids were black, so so Snow White had to look like the kids. And I talked to the woman that ran the daycare center, and she says it had nothing to do with race. Let's see the next one. These were wonderful things. I mean, I stayed staring at this darn thing, and I thought, you know, may as well be looking at the Michelangelo or something.
It's true.
And it was just some homeless guy that you know, happened to come by and say, look, do you want me to paint your shop? And the owner said yes, and gave him the only paint he had. So he worked, and that's what he came up with. Let's see the next one. And these are the signs. And I'm showing you this because then you'll see the next step, what happens to... then there are these immigrants that come to Detroit, both Albanians and Greeks. So the Albanians and Greeks have this fast food franchises, except that they give it a special tone and color and presence. And of course, this gets completely unrecorded. It's not something that gets, let's see the next one. So here you have a chicken place. It was a chicken franchise that is all over the country. And then again, it gets transformed into a local franchise. I went there. I took this picture at night. I went there during the day. And I was talking to the folks there, and I said, when was the last time a white person came in here? And they look at me and they say, well, yesterday there was a lady that needed to pee. So she came running in and did what she needed to do. Let's see the next one. There is an artist that's famous all over the world called Tyree Guyton. Guy with real, he's so stubborn. And, you know, Coleman Young used to hate his stuff, you know, so he would take these houses and fill them up with all the stuff that he found on the streets of Detroit or the abandoned houses of Detroit. And then Coleman Young would send the bulldozers, and those would be the buildings that would get demolished. So he had this Rosa Parks bus there, and the Rosa Parks bus sat on that lot for a long time until his fame started rising. So then they took the bus and took all the different faces that you see on the side, you know, and sort of tried to sell them on the side. And then, so the bus is not there anymore. So let's see the next one. And then Detroit, the presence of Detroit in the international media started growing and growing and growing. I mean, there was a time when almost every week the New York Times would have an article about Detroit. It had to do with places to have coffee. It had to do with restaurants. It had to do with rebuilding the downtown. Essentially, there were 7.2 square miles of downtown that were being rebuilt. This is a city that at one time had close to 2 million inhabitants. Now it's down to about 680,000. It's 79% black, maybe 5-6% Latino, and the rest white. And the white population is growing slowly, but somewhat growing. So with the eye of the international media on the city, artists started coming from all over the world. This one is a tribute by a New Zealander to an artist from Houston that used to do work in Detroit, and his name was Next. And of course, the graffiti artist, the muralist, portrayed an image of sort of fun people, party people. So he's opening a bottle of champagne with a big knife, which the city didn't like because it has the highest homicide rate of any large city in the United States. So they say to the lady that owns the store there that's responsible for the wall, you have to get rid of that knife. So here's what happened. Let's see the next one. So what you have, and here is just to give you some idea of this sort of gentrification at its best in Detroit. They've created places like what you see in Brooklyn, except that it's more Brooklyn than Brooklyn. So what you have is an old warehouse that at one time was an art gallery, but you see the same concrete floor. You see that the chairs that people are sitting on come from the schools that were closed in Detroit. And that you can see in the back, if you look in the back, everything is written by hand. So the human hand, rather than, letters that are manufactured, it's what you see inside. And also, it becomes a very friendly place and a very beloved place. Let's see the next one. And then you see strange things like this, and you look at it and you say, well, that must be a local folk artist. But because of this interest from all over the world, in this case, this was done by 4 Dutch artists, designers that came from Holland, and they thought that it would be great if everywhere, since there were so many churches in Detroit, that it's been the churches, wherever they put God, they would change God for Detroit. And then it'd be a lot of upbeat stuff. Every time you saw a church, there'll be Detroit saves you, Detroit loves you, Detroit, all of that stuff. But they got nowhere, except that they went to a church, and then they talked to the minister, and the minister talked about dry bones, that God was no dry bones. So then they came with this idea to put on the outside of the church, and then they put it there. But it's explaining this very complicated situation where the look of the city is being influenced by people that come from all over the world, from China, from New Zealand, and so on. Let's see the next one. And here, this is what you. At one time, Detroit was in a struggle with the suburbs. Coleman Young had the famous sentence, when they said there are too many guns in Detroit. He said, we'll get rid of our guns when the suburbs disarm. So it's true. So it was like, it's this tremendously adversarial relationship, but it changed. So the most significant, most important people in Detroit now are 3 billionaires, the mayor, then there are people like a local entrepreneur that's very successful, and they're all white. And here you have a city that's 79% black. So the city has made peace with the suburbs. So as a result, what you have is an influx of volunteers that come to some of the worst neighborhoods in Detroit. But instead of bringing instead of using the symbols from the local artists or the local population, they bring their own feel-good symbols. So this is from some place in Illinois, I think, some Methodist church. So the kids come in and they do their idea of what is fun, what's happy. So this way you liven up an abandoned house. The next one, please. So here, this was a more art-oriented person that copied this from an artist called Hokusai. And then even the quotes from the Bible were different. So let's see the next one. Then, because so much has been demolished in Detroit, there is so much space, people are planting a lot. There's a lot of gardening going on. So you have something that they call farm city. So the idea is that there's It's out of what at one time was thought to be, the worst failure as a city. Then it's looked at a city, a resurging city full of gardens where people are going to have their own goats and have goat cheese and milk and grow pigs and chickens and all of that stuff. And you'll be again in touch with, with your 19th century. And you have all these different types of people that are coming in, like the Mad Max urban characters or something or other. So this is a local person that has like 4 or 5 lots, and he's being supported. You see, the story is that he's getting a lot of his support from England. And he's getting a lot of his support from England because somebody made a very good video about him that played in England. And people come in and see him, and he talks, and he's very articulate. Let's see him again. And here we're getting close to the end, and I'm going to show you what happens to some of the ruins. This is the Packard plant. It's a very large car plant. It was just one plant, and at one time, in 1943, there were 36,000 people working in that plant. They made airplane engines, they made cars, very famous cars. So we're going to see what happened to this building in 25 years. So if you go to the next one. See, there used to be, at one point, the building was full of stuff like used shoes, cardboard, stuff there was an industrial laundry. If you wanted to take a car apart, you would drive it there and you would take it apart there. Let's see the next one. You see, so slowly it's coming apart. Let's see the next one. So it was defined as Motor City Industrial Park because they wanted it to be an incubator of businesses. But the businesses they got raves, so there would be all these dances and drinking going on there, music, and at one point there was pellet wars. So people would take guns and go through the different floors of the factory trying to shoot each other. So let's see the next one. I think this is the last picture.
Yep. Okay,
with the last picture, you can see that what's beginning to happen, somebody bought it, I believe, for $400,000, 1 mile-long factory. And there he tried to put again the same sign, but he did it on the cheap and put the same clock. There was a clock there that the factory had, and then farther down you see a billboard with old models of Packard, as if this stuff was going to resurrect or bring back whatever was there. I thank you very much, and I hope to clarify if you have questions, to be able to elaborate a little bit more. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's true what Camilo said, that there's a lot of overlap in terms of what you're trying to do, right? That there's so much change and flux in the world and trying to preserve stories. And I'm just curious to have you both talk about why you chose to focus. Your entry points are very different. Dave, for you, it's people and their stories, individuals, maybe with friends or family. And Camilo, for you, it's buildings and streets and infrastructure. And just talking a little bit about how that entry point came and why it's important to you.
Sure.
Dave?
Well, I mean, Camilo's a photographer, and I have no, I have like a wooden eye. Like, I have absolutely no ability to visualize things. But I think that there is a lot of similarity between the work. There's, when you look at this stuff, I mean, and I think Camilo said that it's poetry,
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're trying to do with StoryCorps is every week on the radio, it's about, the poetry in the voices we hear. This is all about stuff that's hiding in plain sight all around us, and just focusing on places that, that I personally think are, the most interesting people, the most interesting places. So yeah, I mean, it's stories because that's what's interesting to me. You know, I fell into doing radio when I was young, and it was always about the human voice. And to me, you know, the human voice, it's like a story authentically told is like an adrenaline shot right to the heart. You know, it's like it just like kind of lights you up.
Well, radio is a great leveler too, in a way, because there can be a lot of character and distinctiveness in voice, but we don't have the visual that might cut off.
Well, that's what I mean. One of the things that I love about, and we do this in the books too, in the books and in the radio pieces, like you have no preconceived notion about a person whose story you're hearing. In the books, we very consciously wait to show the pictures of the people until you're done reading about it, and that's I think that's an important element because a lot of the stories we do are from you know, places that are, you know, ignored mostly by the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm. And Camilo, for you, choosing not, I know you interview people and you have relations, we both go into communities in different ways, but why not focus on people and their stories? Why on buildings and their stories?
I remember one of the first times I spoke in public was at the Museum of City of New York, and I showed some of my pictures. And somebody stood in the audience and said, "You call yourself a documentary photographer and you don't photograph people." And so that has been hunting me all along. But the truth of the matter, I mean, if I have to answer, it's that people would give me a rap. And I think the rap, you know, I wouldn't know where truth lies in that rap. I know where truth lies in repeated photographs, because then I can tell what happened to that building, you know, over time, so I can correct the person. I say, well, it wasn't quite like what you say, you know, and so in a sense, I try to get to people and to people's life through the buildings, through the environment. And I think that's a greater and greater opportunity all the time, now that you have Google Street, and you can go from 2007 to the present almost, and revisit the places. Mm-hmm. You know, so you go with the knowledge of where people live and what their surroundings are, and what do they, you know, where do they take the bus?
Yeah.
You know, so.
Dave, you know, I know you didn't set out to tell cities of stories in quite the specific way that Camilo did, but it strikes me that both of you have been working for a long period of time in which we've seen kind of cities come back, you know, from a sort of a decline, then be hit by the whole economic downturn, and then be returning again in mixed ways, in different ways. And I'm wondering what, having done that work over this period of time, Dave, you've discovered in terms of people and how they deal with changes in these urban settings. What strikes you?
I don't. You know, I think what happens with StoryCorps, because the nature of what's happening in the booth, it's two people talking about what's most important in their lives. And what comes out in these interviews, people just kind of talk about the great themes of their existence. It's about love and dreams and family. So, you know, we've been doing this for 12 years, and we've been in big cities and, you know, every part of the country you can imagine, the smallest possible towns. And we don't see a lot of change in what's talked about over time, over geography, depending on what's going on with economics and so forth. I mean, people, you know, when they're, you know, people think of it as, if I had 40 minutes left to live, what would I, you know, say, you know, and kind of summing up their life as best possible. So in essentially what's happening in a StoryCorps booth is we're kind of collecting the wisdom of humanity, and it's very, very, very similar across time and across geography. So it's not the right place to draw inferences, I think, about how cities change.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, like even in the Generations chapter in Callings, right, a lot of the recurring narrative for people of a certain age, I'll say, was not even believing it was possible to do what they could do, right, where they ended up. In many cases, going to college or, you know, becoming a specialist in something. And I wonder if in that sense, you know, you see sort of these broader social transformations, whereas their children then follow in their footsteps or don't. But there definitely seems like work obviously across the board has this deep meaning for people, but there's something different about what our horizon is.
Sure. Although I'm not sure that that's related to rural versus cities. Yeah, I mean, Studs Terkel, whose birthday it is actually tomorrow. He would have been 100 and something. Someone here must know, 104 or something like that. Obviously, he wrote about working in such a powerful way, and he talked about the bottom-up history through our lives and stories, and the importance of those. StoryCorps certainly, captures those big moments in American history. There's a lot of stories, as you said, about women who are firsts and so forth. Mm-hmm. But again, so that is captured in StoryCorps certainly, and you do see differences. But again, I mean, I think that what you get from the StoryCorps book is that people it's people who found meaning in their work, and that doesn't change so much over time.
What strikes me about both of your work is that, I mean, it's not that there isn't the subjective isn't an element of it, but it's almost as if you've decentered it by, in StoryCorps, anyone can come into the booth, and clearly you're doing, editing after the fact and sort of determining which stories go out. But Camilo, in your case, trying to be systematic, that you both cover a lot of different cities and you go back hundreds of times. I mean, how many times have you been? You were shooting in Gary, Indiana. You sent me a photograph last night. How many trips have you made there?
To Gary, 50?
Yeah.
Maybe more. Spending a day or two, or nights now.
So taking this frame where you kind of maybe take your selecting out of the process a little bit, what does that allow you to see that you wouldn't otherwise? What does that get you?
Well, I think I see the future as unpredictable. I mean, I don't have, that's why I came to Chicago, and I would hear the word success everywhere. And there's obviously that desire that people will overcome poverty, that people will, acquire some wisdom, that they will not get into wars, and, that they will have fulfilling lives and all of that. Mm-hmm. But I want to be able to have a set of sensors that are distributed throughout the poorest parts of the country, because those are the ones that interest me. And through those sensors, to be able to read what is happening, whether it's failure, success, whether it means I love the people or I don't love the people, whether, it's just I want to see what it's there. Mm-hmm. And that's what drives me, and that's why I find so interesting. And that's why I try to tell you this story of Detroit, that if I had told it to you 20 years ago, you'd say, this guy is just hallucinating. Dutch people painting murals out there, 30,000 Lutherans lost in the worst neighborhoods of Detroit, picking up trash and tires, from all over the country. That happened last year. So I want to be able to have a way that will capture those strange and sometimes very beautiful things.
I think that obviously what we have in common is we're stubborn. I think you used that word before, and we're just doing. And I think that these are the stories that speak to us, right? I mean, this is why you want to get up. These are the stories that we find beautiful and make you want to get up in the morning and kind of shake you on the shoulder, and say, "This is what being alive is all about."
How much do you think about the work you do as a tool for social change?
I think about it a lot. I've always felt that, media put to its highest use can be one of the greatest forces for good the world has ever seen. But I think that a lot of the, if you look at the country today, a lot of what's happening is it's about fear, and it's about fear of the other, and that fear is because we don't, we aren't listening to other people. If you think about what happened with, marriage equality, that was, everything. It, began to change with, very quickly with LGBT rights, because there were a lot of people who might have been opposed to marriage equality who realized that their sons or brothers or parents were gay. And when you know someone who's gay, it completely changes the playing field on where people stand on a particular issue. So I think what we're trying to do, I think of StoryCorps as kind of a stealth weapon for good, and what we're trying to do is tell that tell that truth of letting, as I said up there, of kind of recognizing ourselves and people who we might have feared and building those kind of bridges. And I think that essentially that's the end game for StoryCorps. It's about culture change and alleviating the fear and recognizing how much we share in common.
Just to press on the point that you raised earlier about the truth and how do you get to that. I mean, it's true that truth isn't necessarily what the facts are, but with your stories at StoryCorps, you fact check them, right?
Yeah. So every story so we've done. I just saw the figure last week. It's 0.04% of the tape we record that actually makes it to air, to broadcast, or in books or in animations, and all of those. Stories are fact-checked within, to the New Yorker standard of fact-checking within an inch of their lives. But, we found we've had 700 stories on broadcast in a row every week on NPR, and only 2 of those haven't checked out. And one of them was actually last week.
Can you talk about it?
I cannot. I've been moving around so much, I can't remember what it was, but it wasn't true. That's all I remember. I actually think that it's when you're. I think it is possible to figure out from when you're listening to something whether it's authentic or not, and whether someone's really speaking the truth. Now, their memory may be off. There are these crazy vagaries of memory. I interviewed we were talking about my dad out there, and I did an interview with my dad, who was a really amazing man who was a gay rights activist, and did a StoryCorps interview with him. First or second year of StoryCorps, never thought much about it, and he died very suddenly 8 years later. And that night, I listened to that interview for the first time at 3 a.m, and knowing that I'm an old dad, that my young kids were going to get to know my dad through that recording only, and that's when the rubber really hit the road for me with StoryCorps. But when I interviewed him, one of the classic StoryCorps questions is, what are you proudest of in life? And everybody who has kids says, my kids. And my dad, who wrote, books, said, my books. And for the next 8 years, I teased him. Every time I saw him, I was like, there have been tens of thousands of people who come to StoryCorps, and every single one, if you ask what are you proudest of, they say, my kids. And you're the one person, and I happen to found StoryCorps, who said, my books. But then the night he died, I listened to the tape, and when I asked him what he was proudest of, he had said, my kids, so, yeah.
Truth is a funny thing.
Yes, it is. Memory is a funny thing.
And memory. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. We'll be passing mics around. Put your hand in the air if you have a question. Wait to get the mic in front of you.
One of the things that comes to mind is allocation of resources and how we choose to spend money on. For me, the big passion is education, what we choose to spend money on and what we choose not to spend money on. And, when you look at the photographs that Camilo has taken over the years, I think you sort of got this lens, literally and figuratively, that you can see the cities through, where you could actually see where we've spent money. And I think in the first meeting between Mayor Emanuel and Karen Lewis, the head of the union, he said something that was basically, there are kids that are worth spending money on and kids that aren't worth spending money on. And if you look at Chicago schools, you can see that. So just if you can talk about that whole notion of allocation of resources and how we as a society are choosing to allocate those resources and what that makes the two of you think in terms of your work.
I'm terrible at predicting anything. What I like to do is just follow things and find out, and then tell stories about what I have found out. and then let people look at what I have and use it any way they want. People in New York, they love my pictures of the Bronx because it shows how bad New York was in the 70s. So then they say, look, we've come a long way. But that was not the reason why I took those pictures. And I never thought they were going to be used that way. Mm. So this is a tricky thing, you see. It's just, I can't say I'm for the good, the truth, and the beautiful. I'm here because I'm here. And because I want to see and see and see. And that's it. And be able to tell what I see.
That's beautifully put.
Thank you.
I think I think, did Mayor Emanuel said that? That is apeshit crazy. Yeah. Look, I think that, we live in I was thinking as Camilo was talking, we live in this crazy, it's hard, everything is phony. It's hard, you don't know what's real. What's an advertisement? When you look at Camilo's stuff, you're seeing you can feel it. It's real, And I think when you think about the criminal justice system, which I started talking about. The message that every possible message to people in the criminal justice system is that your life has absolutely no value, and would be better off if you never existed or you were dead. And the idea of StoryCorps, and I think what Camilo's doing by just showing the beauty of people and places, and what did he said, the Michelangelo painting on the, which I agree, that what StoryCorps does is it just reminds us of that truth, that all of these stories and lives are so important and so valuable, and kind of shakes you out of I feel like we're all kind of in a trance, shakes you out of the trance and reminds you what's real, and that everybody, I think when Morgan is back there, who's one of hundreds of facilitators that we've had, and they go out on the road, they call it bearing witness and collecting the wisdom of humanity. And if you ask them, what they've learned when they come back, all of them, I haven't asked Morgan yet, but all of them will say that, that people are basically, good. And that there's just value, everywhere, and incredible human potential, and not to give up hope. So yes. To whatever your question was, yes.
Did you have a chance to photograph the enormous Western Electric plant? And right now it's pretty much a low-end shopping center. I thought that might have been one of your subjects.
Where was it located?
In Cicero at Cermak and Cicero Avenue, right outside the city limits.
I think I may have gone there a couple times. I don't know if it's part of my series that I have done. But one thing that makes me very happy, it's not far from there, is a view from California, very near Taylor Street. There is a site there that to me was back in 1980, was a scene of deindustrialization. There were all the smokestacks, all these factories, none of them working, but there were 5 or 6 of them with gigantic smokestacks. And over the years, I've seen most of those disappear. And I went back this time on this trip, and I looked at the site, which at one time had been all full of tires. There were thousands and thousands of tires there in this field. And now it's called Field of Dreams, because there's going to be a sports facility there. And this is what I'm talking about. It's something that I can't predict, Who would have said? For some reason, I was fixed on that place. There's a Brinks parking lot, and Brinks has a site on one side. And the other side is it's this industrial place, which is not far from where Sears was. But Western Electric, I don't have. I'm sorry.
Dave, this is for you. With your new book, This collection of individuals who seem to have been lucky enough to find their calling and feel that they're living with purpose. What are some of the common denominators and common themes of those individuals?
Well, some people, I think that the last three words of the book are a grandfather who's 93, who's since passed away, who grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, talking to his granddaughter. He was supposed to stay on the dairy farm, and she asked him what he's learned, what she needs to know about her work life, and he says, live with courage. And I think that what you see in people who found their calling. I mean, one is that I was lucky enough when I was 21 years old to be struck by lightning and fall into radio over 24 hours, and I'm thankful for that every day. But you see people in this book who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who find it then. And I think that, I think the answer is to be very, all of us, I think, have a voice inside that if we listen very closely knows what it is that we're meant to do. And all the people in this book, everyone who's, followed their calling, many of them are doing something that pays much less money than what they would have been doing otherwise. I think I remember, Camilo, in one of your books, you write about how someone came up to you and said, it's gonna, in 100 years, you have no idea the value of this thing. And you were like, well, but I can't even put food on the table, right? This was before the MacArthur, So it's people who make sacrifices, but work very, very, very hard and listen to that voice inside them and do that thing that really matters to them. I mean, I think that there's this. Camilo was talking about this success thing. There's this idea in the ether that success is working for as few years as you can, making as much money as you can, and then retiring. And the message in this book is that there's a very different kind of dream in terms of work, which is, working incredibly hard, never giving up, doing work that matters, doing work that means something to other people. And that is really the dream, and that you have to keep fighting for that until you find it.
How do you see, or do you see that how people interact with telling stories changes depending on how they're recorded, like kind of going into a booth and having that immersive experience versus recording stories through your app?
Well, I think what it's a tribute to the facilitators, again, that people are incredibly comfortable when they come into the booth and have this remarkable experience. And I think what the microphone does is it gives you the license to ask questions and talk about things you've never talked about before. What happens on the app is very, very, very similar to what happens in the booth, and I didn't expect that to happen. The interviews are shorter, but the spirit is the same, and people are using it with integrity. I mean, I think it's all about the intent. And again, the intent of StoryCorps is our kind of Hippocratic oath is that if people come, when you think about media, so often, like you look, I've been on book tour, and I left my cell phone on a plane, and instead of listening to whatever I'm listening to on my cell phone, I had to watch CNN at the gym, and I almost jumped out the window. I mean, it was just terrible, So I think that with StoryCorps, our Hippocratic oath is that when you come to StoryCorps, you're going to leave. In so much of media, it kind of takes something from you. It's like sucking something from your soul, and with StoryCorps, like if you're going to get something from being at StoryCorps, or it's game over, or it's not StoryCorps. So I think in general, I mean, I see Alex Kotlowitz back there, who's been a great hero of mine, and does incredible work. But again, I think that whether it's radio or print or film, it's if you go in, and I used to talk to journalism schools, and in my head the title of it was like "Don't be an asshole," which is really like that's the key. Like if you go in and you're like, you listen honestly, you're actually interested in what people say, you're honest with them, then, you know, remarkable things can happen in an interview. So it's not, and I think that's what you see in Camilo's photographs also, that there's a purity of spirit and generosity in the work, and that comes out in the final product.
It's a fine note to end on, that we should all go forth and not be assholes.
Yes.